The moment the kennel door closed between them, the smaller puppy went still. Audrey Mills froze with the intake form still in her hand. Across the narrow gap, the bolder puppy pushed both front paws through the bars, reaching until one tiny paw touched his brother's. Only then did the smaller one loosen, just enough for his shaky breath to settle. Miles Corbin saw it. A former Navy SEAL did not need much noise to understand fear. He had seen men hide it behind jokes, silence, anger, and empty stares. But this was different. These two 6-week-old puppies were not afraid of the shelter, or the lights, or the strangers around them. They were afraid of being apart. "They need to stay together," Miles said. Darren Whitlock, the shelter manager, looked down at the 2 intake cards and snapped his clipboard shut. "No," he said. "They need separate files, separate photos, and separate chances. Bonded pairs stay here too long." Audrey glanced at Miles, already sensing the storm under his still face. The bolder puppy pressed his head against the bars. The smaller one leaned into that touch like it was the only solid thing in the room. Miles lowered his voice. "You separate them, you break something." Darren's eyes hardened. "Don't turn 2 puppies into another ghost you couldn't save, Miles." The room went silent. None of them knew those 2 puppies were about to uncover the one thing Darren Whitlock had spent his whole life refusing to face. "Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story travels." Staunton, Virginia, woke slowly in early spring. With mist caught low over the rooftops and redbud trees along the side streets just beginning to show their first purple buds. The town still had that mountain edge quiet at dawn, the kind that made every passing truck sound farther away than it was. On the eastern edge of town, where old pastureland climbed toward the Blue Ridge, Miles Corbin lived alone in a weathered wooden house with a gravel drive and a porch that faced the hills. He was 43, a former Navy SEAL, and no one in Staunton ever seemed fully sure what to do with that information. Some people expected a harder man, louder in his opinions, quicker with stories about places most folks only saw in the evening news. Miles gave them none of that. He bought black coffee at the same gas station, fixed his own fence when spring wind knocked a rail loose, and spoke to animals with more patience than he usually gave to people. Blue Ridge Animal Haven did not keep him on payroll. Still, everyone there knew who got called when a case needed someone willing to sit in the dirt, wait in the cold, or spend an hour doing nothing except making himself less frightening to a scared dog. Miles had helped bring in a young hound that hid under a pickup after a night of fireworks, an old terrier wandering near Route 250 with a faded collar and no tags, and a loose cattle dog that kept circling the parking lot of a feed store but backed away every time anyone reached for a leash. Those cases never made good stories at fundraisers. There were no dramatic saves, no applause, no clean ending tied with a bright ribbon. They were ordinary little battles of patience. A bowl placed 6 feet away, a truck door left open, a hand lowered palm down, and kept there until the animal decided the world had not come to grab it. Miles understood that kind of waiting. His phone rang at 7:18 that morning, just as he was rinsing yesterday's coffee from the bottom of a chipped mug. Audrey Mills's name lit up on the screen. She worked intake at Blue Ridge Animal Haven, though intake meant whatever the morning demanded. Paperwork, phone calls, cleaning kennels, calming adopters, lifting carriers, and sometimes saying yes before she knew who would help her carry the weight of it. "Morning, Miles," she said, and her voice carried that apologetic softness people used when they were already asking too much. He dried his hand on a towel. "What have you got?" A woman on Maple Row called about 2 puppies under the porch of the abandoned house at the end of the block. She's seen them there a couple times since yesterday. They duck back whenever she gets close. Miles looked out his kitchen window. Fog lay thin over the pasture beyond his fence, and a robin bounced once across the wet grass before vanishing under the lilac bush. Any sign they're hurt? Nothing, she mentioned. She just said they're small and won't come out. Audrey hesitated. I know it doesn't sound like much, but we're short 2 people this morning, and Darren wants it handled before the phones start stacking up. There was a small pause after Darren's name, the kind Audrey probably wished she had hidden better. Miles set the mug upside down in the sink. I'll go. He did not say it warmly, but Audrey heard the answer beneath the words. Thank you. I'll text you the address. Miles pulled on his old canvas jacket, took a clean carrier from the mudroom, folded a soft blanket inside, and packed a small container of puppy food Audrey had left with him after the feed store case. By the time he backed his silver pickup out of the drive, the morning had brightened just enough for the fog to turn pale over the low fields. The roads into town were damp from overnight mist, and the tires made a soft hiss over the blacktop. At first, it felt like another small errand in a town full of small errands. But some mornings hide their weight until a man is already halfway there. Maple Row sat in the older part of Staunton, where narrow houses leaned close to one another, and front yards were divided by tired fences and stubborn flower beds. The abandoned house stood at the end of the street behind a gate that sagged open. Its white paint had peeled down to gray in places, and the porch bowed slightly in the middle, as though the house had been holding its breath too long. Miles parked by the curb and stayed in the truck for a moment, watching. A curtain shifted in the neighboring house. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and gave up. The air smelled of wet wood, young grass, and the faint metal scent of an old storm drain warming under daylight. He took the carrier and blanket, then walked through the open gate without rushing. Near the porch steps, small paw marks crossed a patch of soft dirt and disappeared beneath the boards. Miles crouched, shifted his weight to keep the old steps from creaking, and angled his flashlight toward the ground, rather than straight into the dark. 2 puppies lay beneath the porch, tucked close behind the lowest step. They were small enough that their paws still looked too large for their bodies, with soft ears and round faces, and that uncertain watchfulness young animals carried before they learned which parts of the world were safe. One had a darker muzzle and a thin white stripe down the chest. The other was slightly smaller, pressed close behind him, one shoulder hidden in the shadow. The bolder puppy stared at Miles. He did not bark. He did not dart deeper under the porch. He simply placed one paw over the smaller puppy's paw and held it there, as if that touch was part warning, part promise. Miles had seen dogs refuse food, refuse leashes, refuse doorways, refuse men in uniforms, refuse every kind of kindness, because kindness had arrived too quickly. This was different. The bolder one was watching Miles, but the smaller one was watching the space between them. Easy, Miles murmured. His voice was low enough that it seemed meant more for the porch than for the puppies. He set the carrier on its side near the opening and arranged the blanket so it made a soft tunnel toward the door. Then he opened the food container and placed a little on the blanket, close enough for them to smell, far enough that they would not feel cornered. The bolder puppy leaned forward, sniffing. The smaller one stayed tucked back. Miles lowered his hand, palm open, and rested it on the ground without reaching. The porch boards above him creaked lightly in the morning breeze. A car passed somewhere behind him, slow over a pothole, and the smaller puppy flinched. The bolder one turned at once, nose touching the side of his brother's face. Miles noticed that. He waited. After a minute, the bolder puppy moved one paw forward. Then he stopped and looked back. The smaller puppy stretched just far enough to touch him. Only after that did the bolder one take another step. They moved like that for several minutes, not as 2 animals following food, but as two small lives negotiating distance together. One step, a pause, a touch. Another step. When the bolder puppy reached the blanket, he sniffed the food, then turned back again until the smaller one came close enough to press against his side. Miles did not try to lift either of them. He shifted the carrier a few inches, making the opening easier, and let his hand stay still near the blanket. The bolder puppy stepped inside first, then turned in the tight space and reached out with his nose. The smaller one hesitated at the edge, eyes moving from Miles to the carrier and back to his brother. A spring wind moved through the old fence, rattling one loose board behind him. The smaller puppy startled, but the bolder one leaned forward from inside the carrier and touched his muzzle to him. That was enough. The smaller puppy crawled in, and the two of them folded together on the blanket as naturally as water, finding the lowest place in a creek bed. Miles closed the carrier door gently. On the walk back to the truck, he kept the carrier level against his side. The puppies shifted once when the gate hinges squealed, and by the time he set them on the passenger seat, the bolder one had already tucked himself against the smaller one again. Miles buckled the carrier in, then sat behind the wheel without starting the engine right away. He looked through the plastic door. The smaller puppy blinked slowly, still pressed close. The bolder one kept his paw draped over his brother's front leg, not gripping, not guarding in any way a person could write on a form, but staying there all the same. Miles turned the key. The pickup rolled away from Maple Row, past the damp sidewalks and the redbuds beginning to bloom, toward Blue Ridge Animal Haven. Every time the tires crossed a rough patch of road, the carrier trembled, and every time it did, one puppy found the other before settling again. Miles kept one hand steady on the wheel. By the time the shelter sign came into view, he had the uneasy feeling that he had not picked up two stray puppies at all, but carried back a question no one at Blue Ridge was going to want answered. Blue Ridge Animal Haven was already moving too fast. When Miles walked through the side door with the carrier, balanced against his hip, the washer thumped behind the utility room, a phone rang unanswered at the front desk, and, somewhere down the kennel row, a large dog paced with steady nails, clicking against concrete. The air held the usual mix of old coffee, clean towels, floor disinfectant, and the damp warmth that gathered in buildings where too many living things waited for someone to choose them. Audrey Mills looked up from the intake computer, saw Miles first, then saw the two small bodies folded together inside the carrier. Her face changed before she said a word. "Those are the Maple Row pups?" Miles set the carrier gently on the stainless steel table. "Found them under the porch. They came in on their own once they realized they could come together." Audrey pulled a pair of gloves from the box, then stopped for half a second when one puppy shifted and the other shifted with. They were still unnamed, still only a call on the morning board and a line waiting to be filled in the intake system. She reached for two blank cards, clipped them side by side, and tapped the end of her pen against the table. "We need temporary names before I can enter them." Miles watched the bolder puppy press his nose against the carrier door. The smaller one stayed tucked close behind him, his chin resting over one paw, his eyes moving between the room and his brother. Audrey glanced at them, then wrote carefully. "Finn for the brave one," she said. "Bram for the little shadow." Miles gave the faintest nod. "That'll do." Audrey opened the carrier slowly, keeping one hand low and steady. Finn stepped out first, paws sliding a little on the steel, then turned back before Audrey could even reach for Bram. Bram stretched forward until his paw touched Finn's ankle, and only then did he follow. The movement was so small that a busy person could have missed it. Miles did not. Finn sniffed the table edge, the folded towel, the corner of Audrey's sleeve. Bram stayed close enough that their sides brushed whenever either of them moved. When Audrey shifted her hand toward the scale, Bram leaned away, but Finn leaned back into him, and the smaller puppy settled as if some quiet instruction had passed between them. Audrey's brows drew together. That's unusual. Miles kept his eyes on the puppies. Yes, the door from the office hallway opened before she could say more. Darren Whitlock stepped in, with a clipboard tucked against his chest and a blue pen clipped to the collar of his sweater. He was in his late 40s, neat in the way men became neat, when they trusted systems more than people. His gray-brown hair combed back, his shoes clean despite the shelter floor. He looked at the table, then at the 2 intake cards. 2 puppies, Darren said. Audrey kept her voice even. Both from Maple Row. About 6 weeks, maybe a little more. We'll need the vet to confirm. Darren wrote something on the top page. We have 3 open kennels, 4 if the Beagle transfer leaves by noon. Food order is already over budget. Keep the intake clean and separate. Miles looked up. Separate? That's the process. Audrey moved carefully, but the moment she lifted Finn toward the first small kennel, Bram leaned forward so quickly that his paws slid on the towel. Finn twisted in her hands, searching. Audrey paused, looked at Miles, then placed Finn inside the left kennel and Bram in the one beside it. The latch clicked. Bram went still. Finn turned sharply, pushed both front paws through the bars, and reached into the narrow space between the kennels. His claws scraped once against metal, light and frantic, until Bram lifted one paw and met him halfway. Their toes touched through the wire. The room seemed to notice. Bram's shoulders eased by a fraction. Finn lowered his head against the bars, keeping that small connection in place. He did not bark or whine. He simply stayed there, pressed close, as if the whole strange room could be endured as long as the gap did not grow wider. Miles took one step toward the kennels. They can't be handled as 2 ordinary intakes. Darren did not look up from the cards. They are 2 ordinary intakes until a vet and behavior notes say otherwise. You're seeing the behavior notes. Audrey set her pen down. Darren, he's right that this is pretty clear. I've seen littermates cling before, but this is different. Bram shut down the second. The door closed. Darren's mouth tightened at the word shut down, as if language itself could make the day more expensive. He looked from Audrey to Miles, then back at the puppies. Finn still had his paw through the bars. Bram's paw rested against it like a small answer. Bonded pairs stay longer, Darren said. People say they want 2 until they see 2 adoption fees, 2 food bowls, 2 vaccine schedules, 2 training plans. Then they take the easier one and leave the other behind. Miles's jaw shifted. So your solution is to make it easier to split them before anyone understands what they are? My solution is to keep this shelter moving. A towel cart rattled past the open door, pushed by a teenage volunteer who looked in, sensed the tension, and kept going. Outside, the wind pressed briefly against the back entrance, making the old frame sigh. Miles stared at Darren, and Audrey saw the change in him. Not an explosion, not yet, but the controlled stillness of a man choosing which part of himself to hold back. There were moments in a shelter when paperwork stopped being paperwork. This was one of them, though Darren had not admitted it yet. Miles lowered his voice. If you separate them wrong this early, you may pay for it later in fear, behavior, trust. That is not sentiment. That is consequence. Darren closed the clipboard halfway. We don't run this place on feelings. No, Miles said. You run it on numbers until the numbers start costing lives in quieter ways. Audrey looked down at the intake cards, suddenly very aware of how thin paper could feel when something living depended on it. Finn nudged the bars with his muzzle. Bram leaned closer, eyes half lowered now that his brother was within reach. Darren turned fully toward Miles. You came in for a pickup. You did the pickup. Let staff handle the placement plan. Miles gave a dry, humorless breath. Staff? You're a volunteer. The word landed harder than it should have, maybe because Darren meant it to. Miles looked at the puppies again, then at the 2 blank boxes on the cards where Audrey would soon mark individual photos, individual descriptions, individual future homes. They need to stay together, Miles said. Darren's eyes hardened. Something moved across his face, quick enough to miss, bitter enough to sour the air around him. Don't turn this into another rook, Miles. Audrey stopped typing. Even the kennel row seemed to fall back for a second, the barking thinning into a distant murmur. Miles stood beside the table, his face unreadable, but his right hand closed around the edge of the steel until the skin over his knuckles went pale. Rook was a name people at Blue Ridge avoided unless Miles brought it up first, and Miles never brought it up first. Behind that name was a German shepherd who had died 3 years earlier. After the Navy, after the noise, after Miles had believed there might still be a quiet life left for both of them. Behind that name was a room at the end of his hallway with the door still closed. Behind that name was the kind of grief that did not ask for attention because it had already taken up residence. Miles released the table. If all you see is cost, he said, then you don't need me here. Miles, Audrey said softly. He turned toward the door. She followed him through the intake room, past the washer and the stack towels, into the spring wind pushing across the parking lot. Give it an hour, she said. Please. You know how Darren gets when the numbers are bad. Miles opened the truck door. Face had gone calm in a way that did not comfort her. No, he said. I know exactly how he gets. Audrey stood beside the truck, arms folded against the wind, while he climbed in and started the engine. He did not look back at the building. He did not look toward the kennel room, where Finn and Bram had just received 2 names, 2 cards, and no guarantee of the one thing that had carried them this far. Miles drove away. Inside the shelter, Finn kept his paw through the bars until Bram touched it again. Miles made it 8 hours before he broke his own silence. By then, Blue Ridge Animal Haven had settled into its tired evening rhythm, with half the overhead lights dimmed, the washer finally quiet, and the kennel row breathing in uneven waves behind the closed doors. Audrey sat in the break room with a paper cup of vending machine, coffee, gone cold beside her elbow. Her phone buzzed at 8:42. Miles Corbin, they eating? Audrey looked at the message longer than she needed to. Then she rose, walked back to intake, and stopped in front of the 2 small kennels near the end of the row. Finn and Bram were asleep against the nearest bars, each in his own space, but their front paws still touched through the wire, like a promise neither one knew how to put down. She took a picture and sent it. Eating, a little. Sleeping better when they can reach each other. Miles did not answer right away. 3 dots appeared, vanished, appeared again, then disappeared for good. Audrey stood there in the soft kennel noise, one hand wrapped around her phone, and smiled in a way that had more weariness than triumph. He had left the shelter. He had not left them. By the next morning, Darren had already marked Finn and Bram for website photos. He wanted 2 image sets, 2 short descriptions, 2 separate adoption listings, and no language that would slow down interest. He said the words in the office doorway while flipping through intake sheets, as though each page had a small leak in it, and money was dripping out. Don't lead with together, Darren said. People scroll past complications. Audrey held the camera strap in one hand. If we hide it, the wrong family could split them. If someone wants both, fine, but we don't make that the headline. The photo room was small and too bright, the kind of room designed to erase everything except a clean face and a clear pair of eyes. A white backdrop hung from a narrow stand. A folded blue towel sat on the table. The ring light made a pale circle against the wall, and every surface smelled faintly of disinfectant. Audrey set the carrier down and took longer than usual, arranging the towel. She filled a small water bowl, moved it twice, wiped the table again, though it was already clean. Every little delay felt foolish, but her hands kept finding reasons not to begin. Sometimes, a person knows a rule is about to do harm before the harm has a name. She lifted Finn first. He did well for the first few seconds. His paws spread on the towel. His ears tipped sideways and his dark eyes moved over the camera, the light, the door, the empty corner where Bram was not. Audrey crouched behind the lens and made the soft clicking sound she used with nervous animals. "Good boy, Finn. Right here." Finn looked past her. His body tightened slowly, as if an invisible string had been pulled from inside him. The steadiness he had shown under the old porch, in the carrier, even beside the intake table, began to drain out through his paws. He did not snap, scramble, or bark. He stood there under the white light with his head lowered, trying to stay present and failing by inches. Behind Audrey, Bram shifted inside the carrier. At first, it was only a small sound, a low, uncertain whine that slipped through the plastic door. Then he pressed forward, nose to the vent, one paw searching along the inside wall. Finn heard it and turned so quickly, his back foot slid on the towel. Audrey lowered the camera. From the hallway, Darren's voice drifted in as he spoke to someone about vaccine schedules and kennel space. He was close enough to return at any moment. Audrey looked at the door, then at Finn, then at Bram's paw moving behind the vent slots. She pulled the carrier closer to the table. She did not open it. She did not take Bram out. She only brought it near enough that Finn could stretch one front paw down toward the side vent. Finn reached. Bram reached back. Their toes touched through the narrow opening, barely more than a brush of fur and nail against fur and nail. Finn blinked once. His shoulders eased. The sharp, faraway look in his eyes softened until he was looking at the room again, looking at Audrey, looking at the world as something he could stand inside. Audrey raised the camera and took the picture. It was not the bright adoption photo Darren wanted. Finn was not smiling in the way people like to imagine dogs smiled. His head was low. His paw was stretched out of frame, and the corner of the carrier showed beside the table like evidence someone had forgotten to crop away. It was the truest photo she had taken all week. Darren appeared in the doorway as the shutter clicked. His eyes moved from the camera to the carrier, then to Finn's paw, touching Bram's through the vent. His mouth pressed into a thin line. "That," he said, "is exactly what makes this harder." Audrey kept one hand near Finn. It's also exactly what a family needs to know. It makes them look dependent. They are dependent right now. That word will bury the listing. Audrey straightened, camera against her chest, and pretending it isn't true, could bury one of them in the wrong home. Darren's expression did not change, but something in his eyes flashed and withdrew. "Separate profiles," he said. "Separate photos. We are not advertising a problem." Finn's paw stayed against the carrier vent. Audrey said nothing while Darren walked away. She finished the session by taking a few more careful images, but none mattered as much as the first. When both puppies were back in their side-by-side kennels, Finn pushed his paw through the bars before Bram even settled. Bram met him there. During her break, Audrey typed a message to Miles and erased it twice. She did not want to beg him back. She did not want to use his grief as a handle, so she sent only what happened. Finn couldn't stand alone for photos. I moved Bram's carrier close enough for one paw touch through the vent. Finn came back immediately. Darren still wants separate listings. The reply did not come for a long time. At Miles's house, rain began after sundown, a light spring rain that tapped the kitchen window and gathered in silver threads along the porch rail. Miles stood barefoot on the old wood floor, reading Audrey's message, while the room around him sat dark except for the stove clock and the thin blue light of his phone. He read it once, then again, The house seemed to hold its breath around him. At the end of the hallway, the closed door waited in its usual place. Miles had passed it thousands of times in 3 years, carrying laundry, coffee, groceries, mail, tools, excuses. He knew the dull brass knob by sight. He knew the thin line of dust along the threshold. He knew how to walk past without letting his eyes slow down. That night, his feet stopped. Miles set the phone on the hallway table and stood before the door. Rain ticked against the glass behind him. Somewhere inside the wall, the old pipes gave a single soft knock. He opened it. The room smelled of cedar, clean cloth, and time. Brooke's leash still hung on the hook beside the bookshelf. His stainless steel bowl sat beneath the window, turned upside down the way Miles had left it after washing it for the last time. The old dog bed held its shallow hollow in the center, a shape the room had kept, long after the body was gone. Miles did not step in at first. He stood with one hand on the doorframe until the rain softened, then reached out and touched the leash with 2 fingers. The metal clip moved and gave a quiet sound, small enough to vanish anywhere else. In that room, it landed hard. By morning, the rain had stopped. Miles walked into Blue Ridge Animal Haven with his jacket still damp at the shoulders, and his face set in the same calm that had carried him through worse rooms than this one. Darren saw him from the office doorway and lifted his brows. "If you're here to drag more pain home," Darren said. "Temporary foster forms are in the second drawer." Audrey looked up sharply. Miles opened the drawer, took the forms, and signed where the yellow tabs told him to sign. He did not argue. He did not look at Darren. When Audrey brought Finn and Bram out together, both puppies stirred at the sound of each other, breathing inside the same carrier. "This is temporary," Miles said to Audrey. "We find the right home, one that understands them." Audrey nodded, relief moving across her face before she could hide it. Darren turned away as if the matter bored him. But when Finn rested his head over Bram's shoulder, and Bram let out a small, settled breath, Darren's hand tightened around the clipboard. For one quiet second, he looked less like a man watching 2 puppies leave. He looked like a man hearing something he had spent years trying not to hear. Miles brought Finn and Bram home just after noon, when the rain had left the gravel drive dark and the grass along the fence shining under a pale strip of sun. His house stood quiet at the edge of the Blue Ridge, with its old porch boards drying in patches, and its windows reflecting the low hills beyond the pasture. Inside, there were no phones ringing, no kennel doors closing, no voices moving too fast from one problem to the next. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator, the smell of black coffee, and the soft creak of floorboards under Miles's boots. He set the carrier in the living room and knelt beside it. "All right," he said, low enough that the house seemed to take the words gently. Finn stood first inside the carrier, nose working against the wire door. Bram stayed tucked behind him, one paw resting over Finn's back leg. When Miles opened the latch, Finn stepped onto the folded blanket Audrey had sent with them, then turned before his second paw had fully settled. Bram waited for that turn. Finn touched his nose to Bram's cheek, and only then did Bram follow him out. They crossed the living room like 2 halves of the same thought. Finn sniffed the leg of the coffee table. Bram came close behind. Finn moved toward the hearth. Bram stopped until Finn glanced back. A truck passed on the road outside, low and distant, and Bram sank slightly at the sound. Finn leaned his shoulder into him until the smaller puppy lifted his head again. Miles watched from the rug. He had seen men cover fear with jokes, rage, silence, and orders. He had watched dogs cover it with teeth or stillness or stubborn refusal. These 2 carried it differently, passing courage back and forth in touches so small a careless person would call them nothing. By late afternoon, the house had begun to learn their rhythm. Finn found an old sock beside Miles's reading chair and dragged it out like a prize. Bram caught the other end, braced his tiny paws, and pulled backward with such serious effort that Miles's mouth shifted before he could stop it. The sock stretched between them, gray and ridiculous, while Finn stumbled sideways and Bram tumbled onto his back. Miles gave one quiet laugh. It surprised him more than it surprised them. Audrey came by after her shift with training pads, extra food, and a folder of foster paperwork that still needed one more signature. She stood just inside the doorway, damp hair tucked behind one ear, watching Finn and Bram sleep against Miles's boot, as if they had been placed there by the house itself. Miles sat on the floor beside them, one arm resting on his bent knee, his face turned toward the window. Audrey did not make a joke about it. She did not call it sweet. She only set the supplies on the kitchen counter and asked where he wanted the food stored. "In the pantry," Miles said. That was enough. For a few hours, the house softened around them. Bram learned the kitchen tile was colder than the living room rug and stepped back with offended dignity. Finn discovered the lower shelf of the bookcase and tried to drag out a paperback by its corner. Miles caught him, traded it for a rope toy, and looked at the chewed edge of the book for a long moment before setting it higher. Then evening settled. The light thinned along the hallway, and every room began giving back old shapes. Finn curled near the place where Rook used to wait while Miles made coffee. Bram nosed the edge of the rug Rook had once claimed as his own. The same rug Miles had nearly thrown out twice and never managed to move. From the kitchen, Miles heard the puppy's nails tapping across the floor, quick and uneven, and for half a breath, his body answered before his mind could stop it. He turned toward the hallway. At the far end, the closed door stood where it always had. For 3 years, Miles had walked past that door with laundry baskets, grocery bags, repair tools, and mail. He had learned the exact angle of his eyes that let him pass without looking too long. He had dusted the rest of the house, fixed the porch rail, replaced a kitchen faucet, patched a screen door, and left that room untouched. Finn and Bram reached it before he did. They stood side by side at the threshold, noses lifted, listening to nothing Miles could hear. Finn placed one paw near the bottom of the door. Bram pressed close to his shoulder. Miles stopped behind them. The hallway held still. He could have turned them away, closed the night around that room again, and told himself the puppies needed rest. He could have carried them back to the living room, shut the hallway light, and kept the past where it had stayed so obediently. But Finn glanced back at him, then down at Bram, as if waiting for permission from both of them. Miles opened the door. The room smelled of cedar, clean cloth, and old sunlight. Rook's leash hung on a wall hook beside the narrow bookshelf. His collar rested below it, the metal tag catching a dull glimmer from the hallway lamp. A stainless steel bowl sat upside down beneath the window, and the dog bed still held its shallow hollow in the center. Finn stepped in first. Bram touched Finn's hind paw and followed. They did not rush through the room or scatter anything. Finn sniffed the dog bed, then sat back with one ear folded strangely over his head. Bram nosed the bowl, startled at his own reflection, and leaned into Finn as if the shining thing might have opinions. Together they circled the patch of floor where the evening light had fallen, then settled against each other under the window. Miles remained by the door. The collar tag moved in the draft and tapped once against the wall. He crossed the room and stilled it with 2 fingers. A person could keep a house clean. He could keep tools sorted, bills paid, fences mended, coffee stocked, and neighbors believing he was managing well enough. He could do all that while one room waited at the end of a hallway with a bowl, a bed, and a silence that had learned his name. Miles sat on the floor beside the doorway. Finn lifted his head and looked at him. Bram yawned, too wide for his face, then dropped his chin onto Finn's paw. Outside, The first crickets started up in the wet grass, thin and uncertain, as if spring itself was still testing its voice. Over the next few days, Miles took notes for Audrey. Finn and Bram could eat from separate bowls if the bowls stayed within sight of each other. They could nap apart for 10 minutes, sometimes 15, before one woke and searched the room with his eyes. If Finn wandered toward the kitchen, Bram followed the sound of his paws. If Bram froze at the washing machine's spin cycle, Finn returned without being called. The truth became harder to ignore because it was quiet. On the fourth evening, Audrey came by with her laptop and the draft of an adoption profile. Miles had made coffee, though he pretended he had only made enough for himself. She sat at his kitchen table, while Finn and Bram played under it, tangling themselves in the laces of her work shoes. Audrey read aloud what she had written, careful with every word. She did not make them sound broken. She did not make them sound easy. She wrote that Finn and Bram were a closely bonded pair, that they settled best when allowed to remain together, and that the right home would give them patience, structure, and room to grow at their own pace. Miles leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Add that they're learning," he said. Audrey looked up. "They're not stuck," he continued. "They're learning. But they learn better when they can see each other." She typed that in. When the post went live on the shelter page, the responses came quickly. Some people shared it with small hearts and prayers. Some asked whether 2 puppies would be too much for a first-time adopter. Others said Blue Ridge was making the adoption harder than it needed to be. That puppies should learn independence early. That people could not be expected to take on double responsibility because a shelter volunteer got attached. Miles read the comments in Rook's room. Finn slept against his left boot. Bram slept against his right. The door stood open behind him, and the hallway light lay across the floor in a long gold stripe. He did not type a reply. Outside the window, a branch moved in the spring wind and touched the siding with a soft, steady knock. Miles turned his phone face down, pulled the blanket higher over the puppies, and left Rook's door open through the night. By Friday evening, the post had traveled farther than anyone at Blue Ridge Animal Haven expected. Audrey watched the share count climb from the shelter office while Darren pretended not to notice from behind his half-open door. Some comments asked honest questions about bonded puppies. Some offered prayers, and some treated the whole thing like poor marketing wrapped in soft language. Miles read almost all of it from Rook's room, with Finn asleep across one boot and Bram pressed against the other, both of them twitching now and then in puppy dreams. Audrey called him just after 6. "There's a spring adoption fair in Raleigh tomorrow," she said. "It's bigger than anything we'll get around here. More families, more space, more chances someone understands what they're looking at." Miles looked down at Finn and Bram. "Raleigh's 4 hours. I know." He rubbed one thumb along the edge of his phone. "Darren approve it?" He approved the table. Not the hope that almost made Miles smile. "I'll drive." They left Staunton before sunrise, when the field still wore a low shawl of fog, and the first bird sounded uncertain in the hedgerows. Audrey rode beside him, with a folder on her lap, 2 coffee cups in the console, and the carrier buckled carefully in the back seat. Finn sat upright for the first 20 minutes, like a tiny officer inspecting the road, while Bram slept with one paw tucked over Finn's hind leg. As the miles passed, the mountains softened behind them. By the time they crossed into North Carolina, the sky had opened into a pale spring blue. Sunlight moved over the windshield, warm enough that Audrey took off her jacket and folded it over her knees. Miles kept both hands steady on the wheel, but every so often his eyes went to the rearview mirror, where Finn and Bram shifted together each time the road changed texture. He had told himself this was only a foster drive. He had told Audrey, Darren, and the paperwork the same thing. Yet with every exit sign that slid past, the distance between his house and their next possible life grew more real. Some goodbyes begin long before anyone says the word. The Raleigh Spring Pet Adoption Fair filled a wide, grassy fairground near the edge of the city. White tents stood in rows, their legs staked into the damp ground, and banners snapped lightly whenever the wind came across the open field. The air smelled of cut grass, paper coffee cups, pretzels warming under heat lamps, and the clean brightness that comes after a night of rain. Audrey chose a quieter corner near the end of the rescue row. It was visible without being swallowed by the crowd. Families passed with strollers and paper bags. Volunteers called greetings across tables, and somewhere near the main walkway, a child laughed so loudly that Bram lifted his head in the carrier. Finn turned at once and nudged him under the chin. Miles saw it. So did Audrey. They set the puppies in a small exercise pen with a low bed, water bowl, and a folded blanket from Miles's house. Finn explored the edge first, sniffing the mesh panels, while Bram followed close enough that their shoulders brushed. After one cautious loop, they settled together near the front, Finn's chin resting across Bram's back, as if the fairground were simply another room they had decided to survive together. People noticed them quickly. A woman in a Navy church cardigan stopped with both hands over her heart. A young couple crouched beside the pen and whispered about how sweet they looked. Two college girls asked if they could take pictures, and Audrey allowed one from a respectful distance. Everyone softened at first. Then came the sentence. "They need to be adopted together," Audrey would say. Sometimes Miles said it instead. The change was almost always visible. A smile would pause, a hand would pull back, a spouse would glance at another spouse, and the bright idea of one puppy would become the heavier reality of two. Some people were kind about it. Some apologized with real regret. Others drifted away without finishing the conversation, already looking toward the next table, where the choices seemed simpler. By noon, Audrey's voice had thinned from repeating the truth. Miles remained calm, but she saw his hand move again and again to the edge of the carrier, smoothing the fabric handle, though it did not need smoothing. Finn watched every face that came near. Bram dozed in pieces, waking each time Finn shifted too far, then settling once their paws touched. A man with a red baseball cap asked if he could adopt the brave-looking one. When Audrey explained the pair, he sighed and said 2 puppies would tear up his whole house. Family with 2 teenagers stayed longer, asked better questions, then admitted their landlord allowed only 1 dog. An older woman cried a little, touched Audrey's sleeve, and said she wished she could help. Wishing did not sign adoption papers. By mid-afternoon, the fairground had grown warmer. Bram slept with his nose tucked into the blanket, exhausted by voices and sunlight. Finn still sat upright beside him, blinking hard, his small body fighting sleep, as though someone had assigned him a post too important to abandon. Miles looked at him and thought of Rook in his last year, rising stiffly every time the front door opened, even when his legs no longer trusted him. Loyalty could look noble from the outside. Up close, it sometimes looked like a body giving more than it had. Audrey handed Miles a bottle of water. "You okay?" He took it. "Ask me tomorrow." She did not push. Near the final hour, when the crowd had begun to thin and volunteers were folding empty boxes behind the tents, a man stopped several feet from the pen. He did not lean over the puppies. He did not whistle, clap, or reach through the mesh. He simply lowered himself onto one knee in the grass and watched. Miles noticed his stillness first. The man looked to be in his late 40s, tall, broad through the shoulders, with silver beginning at the temples and a canvas jacket, worn soft at the cuffs. His face had a familiar structure Miles could not place right away. The line of the jaw, the set of the mouth, the guarded way he held himself even while trying to appear relaxed. He seemed like someone who had learned to wait before asking for anything. Finn opened his eyes. He looked at the man, then turned and checked Bram. Bram stretched one paw until it touched Finn's leg, then lifted his head and studied the stranger too. The man's expression changed. "He doesn't move on without checking where the other one is," he said quietly. Miles looked at him more closely. "Have we met before?" The man gave a faint smile. "I don't think so. Feels like I've seen you somewhere. Maybe I've got one of those faces." Miles almost answered, then let it go. Audrey stepped closer with the folder, and the man stood, brushing grass from one knee. "My name's Wesley Cole," he said. Audrey introduced herself, then Miles, then explained Finn and Bram with the same honesty she had used all day. She told him about the porch, the intake kennels, the photo room, the way Finn steadied Bram, and Bram brought Finn back when the world became too wide. She did not decorate the story. She did not make it easier than it was. Wesley listened to all of it. He asked what they ate, how they slept, what happened when they were apart, whether they could learn confidence over time if kept together. Miles answered that the goal was not to keep them small or afraid. The goal was to give them enough safety to grow without forcing courage before they had the ground for it. Wesley nodded slowly. Inside the pen, Finn stood and walked toward him. Bram followed after one touch. Wesley did not reach down until Finn sniffed the back of his hand, and when Bram came close enough to press against his brother, Wesley stayed still enough for both of them to decide. "I'll take them both," he said. Audrey let out a breath she had been holding for half the afternoon. Miles stood very still. The paperwork took time, as good paperwork should when it concerns living things. Wesley answered every question, gave his vet reference, described his fenced yard, his work schedule, and the quiet room he had already used once for a nervous rescue dog years earlier. Audrey checked each line carefully, but her hand looked lighter around the pen. Before Wesley left, Finn and Bram tucked together inside the carrier, tired from the day and unaware of how close they had come to being passed over again. Wesley rested one hand on top of the carrier and looked at Miles. Some things shouldn't be separated, just because paperwork says they can be. Miles did not ask what he meant. But on the long drive back to Staunton, with Audrey asleep against the passenger window and the fairground fading behind them, the sentence stayed with him. So did Wesley Cole's face, familiar in a way Miles could not explain. Like a door somewhere in the story had opened before anyone heard the hing. First video arrived 3 days after the Raleigh Fair. Audrey opened it in the shelter break room with one hand around a paper cup of coffee, and the other still marked with blue ink from intake forms. Finn was lying on a windowsill in Wesley Cole's house, chin resting on the wood, watching a squirrel move along the fence outside. Bram was on the rug below, wrestling a soft, blue ball between his paws. For 3 whole seconds, they were doing separate things. Then Finn looked down. Bram looked up. Nothing happened after that, which was exactly why Audrey sent the video to Miles. He watched it at his kitchen table. That evening, the house quiet around him, Rook's room open at the end of the hall. Finn and Bram did not call for each other. They did not scramble across the room. They only checked, found what they needed, and went back to being puppies. Miles replayed it twice. By the end of the week, Wesley had sent more updates. Bram sleeping in a small bed while Finn lay a few feet away. Finn carrying a rope toy into the hallway, pausing until Bram noticed. Both of them tumbling through the backyard grass, clumsy and bright under a soft spring sun. Miles was glad they were safe, though gladness sat in him with a weight he had not expected. Some acts of care ended with empty hands. On Saturday morning, Miles and Audrey drove down to Wesley's place to see the puppies for themselves. The house sat in a quiet Raleigh suburb with trimmed hedges, a clean front porch, and rosemary growing in a clay pot beside the steps. Wesley opened the door before they knocked twice, smiling in the reserved way of a man who still seemed surprised by good news. Finn and Bram reached them first. Finn ran straight toward Miles, Bram toward Audrey, then both stopped halfway and switched directions, as if checking whether the other had chosen wisely. Audrey laughed before she could stop herself. Miles crouched, and Finn pushed his head under Miles's hand with the confidence of a creature beginning to trust the shape of his world. Inside, the living room smelled of coffee, clean wood, and the faint green scent of the backyard coming through an open window. Wesley set a tray on the low table, while Finn and Bram rolled across the rug, bumping into each other, separating, returning, and separating again. Their bond had not vanished. It had widened. Audrey watched them for a while, then looked at Wesley. At the fair, she said, a lot of people walked away when they heard they had to go together. You stayed. Why? Wesley did not answer right away. He watched Finn push the blue ball with his nose, watched Bram chase it, and glance back to make sure Finn had not disappeared. The room stayed gentle around the silence. I didn't take them because I felt sorry for them, Wesley said at last. And I didn't take them because it made a pretty story. He folded both hands around his mug. I had a twin brother. Audrey's expression changed first. Miles noticed her stillness from the corner of his eye. Wesley said their father died before they were born, when their mother was 7 months pregnant and already behind on rent. She tried for 5 years to keep the family together, taking cleaning work, church help, whatever neighbors could spare. Then, one winter, after a fever went through the house and the bills stacked higher than the groceries, she made the choice. Poverty sometimes forces onto people who are already broken. One boy stayed, one boy was adopted. Wesley's voice did not crack, but his thumb rubbed the side of his mug until the ceramic made a faint sound under his skin. He said, records were thin, names changed, and by the time he was old enough to search, the people who knew the most had either moved away or died. He had spent years learning how to live with a missing piece no one else could see. Audrey looked at his face then, really looked. The line of his jaw, the shape of his mouth, the guarded eyes that softened only when Finn and Bram moved together. I'm sorry, she said carefully. I don't want to step into something private, but you look like someone I know. Wesley went very still. Who? Darren Whitlock, she said. He manages Blue Ridge Animal Haven. He was adopted young. He doesn't talk about it much. Wesley set the mug down slowly, as if hope were something that could spill. The days that followed moved with unusual care. Audrey did not share Darren's private records. She only told him that a man had reached out with family information that matched what little Darren had once mentioned. Darren dismissed it first, flatly, almost angrily. That night, he opened a cardboard box left by his adoptive parents and found an old envelope with a birth county, a hospital name, and a mother's first name he had not said aloud in years. The past had waited longer than either man knew. Wesley found his own copy of a birth record. Darren found adoption papers with a changed surname and a date that matched. A DNA test confirmed what the documents had been trying to say in their thin official language. They were brothers. Their first meeting happened on Wesley's porch in late afternoon. Darren stood at the bottom step too long, wearing the same neat sweater, holding himself like a man prepared to leave before anyone could ask him to stay. Wesley opened the door and seemed unable to decide whether to reach out or keep his hands to himself. Finn and Bram solved it for them. The puppies burst through the doorway, one tangling in Darren's shoelace, the other nosing Wesley's ankle. Darren bent down to free the lace, and Bram rested his chin on Darren's wrist. His hand trembled once before he covered it by scratching Bram behind the ear. Wesley said, I looked for you. Darren kept his eyes on the puppy. I tried not to. Wesley nodded, not forgiving too quickly, not accusing too late. I figured. A few days later, Darren found Miles in the shelter kennel row. He had a photo on his phone, Finn on Wesley's porch, Bram half asleep against Darren's shoe. I was wrong about them, Darren said. Miles did not answer. Darren looked down at the photo again. And I was wrong about why they made me angry. That was all he offered. It was enough to be real. The policy changed the following week. Bonded animals would receive behavior notes before separate listings were approved. Staff could document what they observed, not merely what moved fastest. Adoption posts had to describe actual needs, even when truth made the road longer. It was a small line in a shelter manual. It mattered. Miles kept volunteering. Rook's room stayed open, though some days he passed it without entering. Audrey came by after late calls, with coffee, paperwork, or quiet, and sometimes they stood together on his porch while the weather shifted over Staunton without asking permission from either of them. Finn and Bram grew into their new house. They learned to play apart, sleep apart, chase separate smells across the yard, and still look back through the sunlight. When Darren sat beside Wesley on the porch, one puppy leaned against each brother's leg, dividing their warmth with perfect innocence. Darren finally understood what had angered him in the intake room. It had never been weakness. It had been memory, returning on 4 small paws. The part I keep coming back to is that little pause before Finn looked back for Bram. Not the reunion, not the changed policy, not even Darren finally finding his brother. Just that small check-in, the kind we all need more than we admit. A look across the room, a hand on a shoulder, someone noticing when the quiet gets too heavy. There is something deeply human in that. We spend so much of life trying to prove we can stand alone, when maybe God, in his quiet way, keeps sending reminders that strength can also look like staying close. Sometimes it arrives through a friend who texts at the right time, a door left open, or 2 small paws finding each other through the bars. The people and events in this story are imagined, but the ache underneath them belongs to real life. Old grief, second chances, shelter rooms, family wounds, and the slow courage it takes to trust again. I'd love to hear what this story brought up for you, whether it's a memory, a prayer, or someone you still look back for. And if stories like this speak to you, liking and subscribing helps keep them coming. May God bless you with someone who notices when you go quiet, and enough grace to keep one door in your heart unlocked. Some doors do not open loudly. They simply stop being locked.